Alright guys, let's talk about all things Juki 563. It's a great large bobbin machine. It's a walking foot, and in fact it's a triple feed walking foot. So wonderful upholstery machine, and it can certainly handle leather. Let's show you how to set up your machine and how to use it, and I'll give you some tips and pointers for things I've learned from using it for several years. Here we go. The head itself is in pretty good condition. It's a LU-563. This model was actually made in Japan. They had really high build standards too. So I run a double light. It's got a magnetic LED light on the back, and then I've got a long gooseneck light. It almost reminds me of like a drafting light. And the advantage there is you really have a good reach. You can get out in front of the machine and put the light right where you need it. I've also got a little piping spool just under the table there. And to hold the piping spool, all I use is just 1/2 inch galvanized pipe. The threaded pipe goes together with a flange, makes a perfect little piping holder. Like most industrial machines, my Juki has a knee lift. And to test if your knee lift is working correctly, just raise the presser foot by hand, and you should be able to release the presser foot with the knee lift. If yours doesn't work that way, there's simple adjustments you can make to the knee lift mechanism from underneath. The mechanicals under a 563 are just a thing of beauty. It's really a well-made machine, and when you pick up a Juki head, I haven't weighed it, but they seem to be about 10 pounds heavier than other models. Down here we have the roller ball for the knee lift assembly, and you want to make sure that that's articulating in a centered way on the part from the knee lift that comes up. The typical adjustment you would make there is loosen a screw below, so you could raise this component so it pushes up further on the roller ball, and it actually releases the presser foot from the knee lift. A couple details on the top of the machine. There are adjustments you can make to change the amount of pressure exerted on your presser foot. This is a minor adjustment. Clockwise on this knob will increase the pressure on your middle foot. That's kind of a mild adjustment. The major adjustment is here. Clockwise on this knob right behind the guide post will give you more pressure on the internal leaf spring that controls the pressure on the outer foot. And on some models there's actually not a knurled nut here. It's just a recessed screw that you would use a flat screwdriver with. Same effect. Clockwise gives you more downward pressure on the presser foot. Here's a common adjustment I've talked about in my other videos, but it's a wing nut that you'll usually find on the back of most walking foot sewing machines. And if you just loosen that wing nut, what it allows you to do is adjust the steppage in your foot. So this mechanism moves up and down inside of a slotted way, and by lifting this all the way up and retightening that wing nut, you'll get maximum steppage of your walking foot. This is what it looks like at maximum steppage. And this is with the wing nut adjusted for minimum steppage. For most projects, somewhere in between is going to be best. So the reverse on the 563 is operated by a big paddle lever that you push down to reverse. It may seem like a silly thing, but I really appreciate that sort of reverse lever compared to one that you have to lift to activate. It's one of those things you can just find it blind, reach for it, and it's always there. Very easy to operate the reverse on the 563. Let's thread up the machine. Of course, you're going to start at an industrial thread stand. Only use industrial spools, not a household type thread. This is a 92 weight thread. It's got a thread sock on it to prevent any tangles. Follow the thread up. It goes through the captive hole in the thread stand. Got this cool classic thread stand. It's really one of my favorites. Come through the hole in the thread stand, and we'll follow that down to the guide post at the top of the machine. You'll hit the guide post twice, once from right to left and once from back to front. It doesn't so much matter whether you enter low and exit high or vice versa. What matters is this second hole that you emerge from should point you down in the direction of your tension assembly. The guide assembly here with 3 holes. You thread from top only, and you exit out the bottom. Do that 3 times. Make sure it doesn't loop around the right end as you put that last one in. From there, make sure your presser foot's lifted. Go around the tension discs this way, back around the thread controller discs, and hold the thread up in here somewhere so that as you lift the thread, you'll hear it click, and that lets you know that you're up past that tab, and when you pull on the thread, the check spring will act on it as you sew. From there, we're just going up the guide towards the take-up arm. Take-up arm, right to left. Come back down the same guide that you've already been up through. There's another guide here. Guide, needle bar thread guide, and then thread the needle from left to right. I don't know if you guys can appreciate how large this U-style bobbin is, but it's twice the size of a G-style bobbin that a similar LU-562 would take. But the 563 actually takes a U-style bobbin, and it's a great advantage if you're doing large projects like sofas or auto upholstery. Let's say this is a freshly wound bobbin and you need to orient it this way so that as you pull the thread from left to right, the bobbin turns counterclockwise to unspool. And from that orientation, just drop the bobbin in over the post and push down the lever. I just put my finger over the bobbin usually and pull it back this way. You got to go back through this anti-backlash mechanism and just make sure that the thread comes beyond this little triangular projection. Once your lower thread is right in that space, you're ready to rotate the hand wheel towards you and pick up the lower thread. So we'll watch as the hook comes around and grabs that thread. That'll snare the bobbin thread for us. Just pass an object under your presser foot, and we've got both top and bottom threads where they need to be. Go ahead and close your slide plate, and you're ready to sew. So grab a little scrap of leather just to set your tension. We're sewing with a number 20 leather point needle. I've set it up to run with a 190 system needle, and that's very different than the needle it was intended to sew with, which is a 135/17 needle system. If you're using a leather point for your machine, you'll be using a 135/16. I just happened to raise up my needle bar so that it would be timed for a 190 needle system. And what that does is it gives me a little bit more clearance between the needle bar and the presser foot when I'm sewing really thick material. There's just less chance that the needle bar is going to knock the feet. And for that reason, it lets me sew thicker material with the 190. But hey, if you've got a stock Juki 563, your needle system is a 135/17, also called a 135/16 if it's a leather point. So the purpose of sewing on this little scrap is just to balance our tension. Do make sure that your presser foot is down. Of course, if you forget and leave your presser foot up and take off sewing, it won't be long and you'll knot something up around the bobbin case area. So rule number 1 is always drop your presser foot. If you get in the habit of using your knee lift, it's spring loaded, so you're not apt to leave that up. So we'll make a few stitches and we'll look at the underside and adjust the tension as needed. Let's see how we're doing. Looks like we're pulling up the lower stitches pretty good. I don't see any loose loops there. If you had loose loops on the bottom, of course you would increase your upper tension slightly. Think about those adjustments in terms of half turns. This knob gets turned clockwise a half turn, retest, continue until you've tightened up your lower stitches and everything looks balanced. I've got a roll of 5/32 piping mounted to my table, and so let's sew up a piping strip just in case the cording like so. And you should be able to put that right under your cording foot. A little hollow under the cording foot will just follow that. Of course, always hold your upper and lower threads back as you begin to sew. Usually when I'm sewing cording, I'm not worried about back tacking because we'll trim the ends, so it doesn't really matter. Adjust your stitch length as needed. This is the button here for stitch length. There's one next to it that is for the safety clutch reset. We'll talk about that in a bit. But if this were a real project, I would recommend that you use a zipper foot for this first step, and that's simply because you won't see those stitches. It offsets the stitches a little bit, and so you won't see them in your finished product. But for demonstration purposes, we'll go ahead and use the cording foot, but I almost always use a zipper foot to sew up my piping. Okay, so 1.5 strips is typically what we use to get it done, and that leaves you a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew things up. So with the servo and the speed reducer, you can go as slow as you like, stitch by stitch if you want, or you can hum along at normal speeds. So I do recommend having at minimum a servo rather than a clutch motor for good control. But a speed reducer will do two things. It'll slow you down and it'll add some more punching power. So if we were sewing this piping into a seam, we would be in this orientation here. And so normally what I would do is staple my parts together just to keep everything even. And so let's go ahead and do that. A little plier nose stapler is a great way to attach your parts together and just keep them from shifting as you sew things together. We'll just go ahead and place that under the presser foot. And with the presser foot down and holding the threads back, here this is going to be a finished seam, so we'd go ahead and back tack. And you'd want to make sure your thread was adjusted, your stitch length was adjusted for not a long basting stitch like you might have used for just sewing the piping up. But maybe 8 to 10 stitches per inch would be appropriate for sewing leather. And so we'll just sew down our seam. With these staples in the seam allowance, it's important that you keep them up in the seam allowance and not right on your sew line. It doesn't seem like a little staple would be much. Those plier nose staplers, they just use staples that are very similar to an office stapler. And so those fine wire staples, they don't seem like they'd be enough to cause the needle any problems, but it can cause needle deflection or even a needle breakage if your staples are too close to the seam. So just keep them out in the seam allowance where they can't cause you any trouble. And you get to the end of your seam and you back tack a few times to lock in your stitch. And then to get to the release point on any of these sewing machines, you go to top dead center at the needle bar, roll the hand wheel towards you slightly. That'll give you a good release point so you can release the threads, low tension. We'll trim our threads and check out what that seam looks like. Okay, so that gives you a nice basic upholstery seam, which is 5/32 piping and leather. We use this a lot for the sides of seat cushion if we don't want to do a top stitch, or you can use it on the side of backrest cushions for old rocking chairs and Morris chairs. It's a great basic seam to master. Okay, so let's demonstrate a regular blind seam that we'll go back and top stitch for a decorative appearance. We'll do a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so these little upholstery cardboard trim strips are great for setting up your seam allowance. Looks like we've got a 1/2 inch there. So we'll go ahead and get our layers aligned and get that in position. Hold your threads back, both top and bottom, as you start to sew. Get a few stitches in and we'll go ahead and back tack. Now most of my projects I would staple together. This is just a short run, so we won't need to worry about it, but don't be afraid to staple your projects together. Those staple holes won't hurt anything because they'll be off in the seam allowance, and it'll virtually guarantee your parts will stay in good alignment as you sew them up. So it's a great way to go to use that plier nose stapler. So just a basic 1/2 inch blind stitch. Come down to the end of your run and go ahead and back tack it. Top dead center, roll the hand wheel towards you a little bit to get to that release point. And let's talk about top stitching. Okay, so the blind stitch is complete. We're going to open up the seam like this. We see we've got a good seam. It's nice and strong as is, but we're going to reinforce it a little bit with top stitching. It also gives you a nice decorative effect. So we'll turn the seam allowance over to the right side here and put it under the presser foot. Now we're still working with a cording foot, and this little ridge that's developed by the seam will ride right in the hollow of the cording foot, and that'll help guide things along. So we'll get going here. If your forward and reverse stitch are aligned, as in a well-tuned leather working machine, you can just go ahead and back tack, and you'll still have a good looking seam. Okay, so you do need to kind of spread the seam as you go. Make sure there's no wrinkles that are working their way in there. And also be concerned that the seam allowance stays laid to the right. Looks like we're doing fine there, so we'll carry on. All I'm doing is focusing on slightly spreading this seam. I'm really not doing anything to advance the material. That's what the walking foot is for. Triple feed walking foot does a great job of pulling that material, feeding that material through the machine. All I'm doing is steering and taking out any excess slack. Back tack at the end, and we'll release it. Okay, so that would be an example of a single felled top stitch seam. That's a real nice detail for the sides of chair cushions, especially if you put that seam on the side, on the boxing side of the cushion. That way the thread is protected from extra wear as somebody uses the seat. There's two buttons on the bed of the machine just here. The one on the left, you depress and rotate the hand wheel towards you to adjust the stitch length. Keep that button depressed and rotate the hand wheel until it clicks in a cog. Once you feel it register, then you continue rotating the hand wheel towards you to increase the stitch length. Rotate the hand wheel away from you to decrease the stitch length. One word of caution here, if you plan to make large adjustments rotating the hand wheel away from you, make sure to unthread the needle. This button is actually a safety clutch release, so unless you're specifically working on the safety clutch or you feel like you popped your safety clutch, don't use that button. This is the one you want for common stitch length adjustment. It's handy to have a little brush so that you can take lint away from the bobbin case area. And there is an adjustment for bobbin tension. There's a couple of screws on the side of the bobbin case. One just here holds the tension tab in place but does nothing to adjust the tension. This one actually changes the tension of the bobbin thread. Now, I recommend you start with the upper thread tension first, just because it's simpler to adjust. The pattern is to increase upper thread tension to help with loose lower loops, right? Well, if there's no amount of adjustment at the upper tension that will solve your problem, you just may need to decrease the bobbin tension. And to do that, use a very small screwdriver. Think about it in terms of quarter turn adjustments. Decrease the bobbin tension by a counterclockwise adjustment to this screw here. If you have the right tools, you can make that adjustment with the bobbin case in place. If not, there's either 2 or 3 little gib screws. You remove this little semicircular gib and you can actually pull the bobbin case out to make that adjustment. The 562 has 2 screws for that little gib, and the 563 has 3 small screws. But if you have a small Singer screwdriver like this, you can easily make small adjustments with the bobbin case in place. Alright guys, there it is, all things Juki 563. Hopefully you found a little tidbit in there that was useful to you, or at least something to look for if you're shopping for a walking foot machine. Thanks for watching, we'll see you on the next one.